Hi, and welcome to Homo Ludens, the channel on history and board games. In today's video, I'm not going to do review, or I'm not going to talk about a specific event. In today's video, I'm going to present my first design called Red Flag over Paris, about the Paris Commune of 1871. Red Flag over Paris. I'm talking to you about this game now because it was recently added to GMT's P500 process. So the idea of the P500 process is that the game is available for pre-order at a reduced price, and as soon as it reaches the 500 pre-orders, we will be entering the final development. So final design, components, graphical designs, final proofreading of the rules, and in-depth playtesting. So what you see now, everything that you see here is only prototype version. For the graphic design, I was helped by a friend of mine called Vincent that did a great job. And I screwed everything around because I'm not a graphic designer, but he gave me a really good basics that I could play with. And for me, this video is going to be about explaining you the mechanics, but also clarifying some questions that I got online about how the game works. The game is about the Paris Commune of 1871. I won't go too much into details about the historical background, and if you're interested to know more about it, I published 2 articles on Inside GMT about this topic. So 2 articles because first I talk about the Franco-Prussian War, and then I talk about the Paris Commune and its implications. But what you need to know is the Paris Commune was a socialist insurrection in Paris. And it was actually not only an insurrection, and that's the whole point. They formed a socialist government in Paris, and they had the ambition of spreading across France. So you actually had 2 conflicting governments, one in Paris and one that was in Versailles, that came out of the February election. So you had competing governments, each of them having troops, each of them having different political agendas. So in a lot of ways, you could say that it was a small civil war that was very much contained in its territory and in over time, but with an escalation of tension. It ended up in a bloodbath during the Bloody Week in May 1871, but they definitely had all the elements of a civil war. It was more or less provoked by the end of the Second Empire, so of Napoleon III, because of the Franco-Prussian War. But once again, you can read more in those articles, and I won't get too much into details about this in this video. For me, the purpose of this video here is to walk you through the mechanics, for you to better understand how the game works, and also explain a bit about why and how I designed it. For those who already know Fort Sumter by Mark Herman, you will already see a lot of similarities with that game, and that is not an accident. Mark Herman's Fort Sumter was a major inspiration for that game, and I used most of the same mechanics because I think it's a brilliant system. You've got spaces on the map on the board, and those spaces are divided into dimensions. You've got political dimensions and you've got military dimensions. You have 4 of them, like in Fort Sumter, and you take control of dimensions by placing cubes on them. If you have more cubes than your opponent, you control space. The overall idea is more or less the same, and I will walk you through a sequence of play because for me the idea is to present you the game, but also how it diverged from Fort Sumter, because there is significant differences between the 2 games that you can only see while going through a sequence of play. So the idea of the game is that you're going to play through 3 regular turns and a final crisis turn. So it's a pretty compact game. What you're going to do during those 3 turns and a half or 4 turns, actually, it's just that they're working a bit differently, is trying to occupy dimensions to score points. Usually what happens if at the end of the turn you control a dimension, like the green one here representing the political institution, you will win a victory point. If you control the black one, you will win a victory point. And that's the idea behind Fort Sumter. In this game there is a slight difference though. Not all dimensions are the same. Dimensions are separated in 2 big categories. You've got political dimensions and military dimensions. And each of them give you access to different kinds of victory points. You've got political victory points and military victory points. Let's say you were in a situation where you control the forts around Paris. You would not win any kind of victory point. You will win a military victory point. And this is not just a detail, because this is linked to the victory conditions of the 2 factions that are asymmetric. The idea behind it is that the Commune never really had a chance of winning a military victory against the government in Versailles, but the struggle was mostly political. And on the other hand, what Versailles was trying to do was to retain actual control over a specific territory. So the two factions are not going for the same victory conditions. Overall, the two factions are trying to win more victory points than the other. But for Versailles to win, they must have more victory points, but also make sure that the Commune doesn't have more military victory points than them. So if we're in a situation like this at the end of the game, where you have Versailles that has +2 military victory points and the Commune has +1 political victory points, Versailles is winning. But if it was the other way around, with Versailles having more victory points than the Commune, but the Commune having 1 more victory point than Versailles, then it would be a tie. Of course, you have tiebreakers afterwards, but it means that having more victory points than your opponent is not necessarily the only condition to win. The kind of victory point is actually quite important, and it's one of the aspects of asymmetry between factions that you have in the game. Let's go back to the turn sequence. The game is played around 3 regular turns and a final crisis, and what happens during the turn is you start by getting 4 strategy cards and 2 objective cards. So, strategy cards. Strategy cards look like this, and all of the strategy cards represent either an important figure of the Paris Commune or a very important event that happened. And then you have objective cards. And objective cards are all linked to a space that exists on the board. So for example, this objective, Rise of Republicanism, is actually connected to the Republican space here. Or this one, Socialist International, is linked to the social movement space that you see here. So the idea is that at the beginning of a turn, you get a hand of cards. Those strategy cards will enable you to take actions on the board. And those objective cards is a space that you commit on controlling at the end of a turn. And if you do control that space, you will get a VP that corresponds to what category the space is in, and you will have the opportunity to trigger a bonus event when you score it. So let's say I'm in this situation and I decide to commit to Republicans, then I will discard the other one, and now I have this hand of card to play through my turn. So now I think it's a good time to actually explain how are the cards working and explain the anatomy of a card. Here again, there is not a lot of surprises. If you've already played a CDG or if you already played Fort Sumter, you already know how to play a card. But I'm gonna go through the core concepts behind it. Every card has a value that you see here represented in cubes. So this card represents Léon Gambetta. You see, so the name of the card, historical flavor mostly. Then you see the value of the card. So this card has 3 value. And then you see the faction of the card. So this one is a bit of a special card. It has both the 2 colors faction, which means that it's a neutral card, which means that the event of the card could be used by 2 players. So the value of the card is here, and then you have the event. When you play a card, you can actually do 4 different things with a card. You can play the card for its event. So the event is only accessible to you if it's your player's faction that is represented on the card. So in this case, it could be any of the player playing it. So you play it for the event, and what happens is that you apply the text as is. Or you could play it for the ops. So once again, pretty straightforward. The only thing that is a bit different in this game is when you play a card for ops, you announce if you're going for military or political ops. And this will constrain the number of action you can take and where you can take them. If I play Léon Gambetta for political ops, it means that those 3 ops, I will only be able to use them in political spaces. If I go for military ops, I will only be able to use them in military spaces. Then there are 2 different things that I can do with a card. One of them is buying an event. So let's say that my opponent played a card of my faction for ops in a previous turn. What I can do is discard a card of equal or greater value to actually trigger the event if I'm interested in it. So let's say I'm Versailles, the Commune player has played Général Ernest de Cissé in the previous round. What I will do is discard a card of my faction or another faction of equal or greater value, and I would say, well, I'm gonna trigger this event with that card. So that's the 3rd usage. And then there is one final usage for a card, and this is to burn a card. So let's say we have a discard pile over here and have a card in my hand. And usually it's useful if it's an event from your opponent, because when you burn a card, you actually discard it at the bottom of the discard pile. And what this enables you to do is increase your player momentum. So you see here, you have 2 player momentum tracks, revolutionary momentum for the Commune and Prussian collaboration for Versailles. And when you do this, you get 1 step on your momentum. Let me explain you a bit about the momentum, because it's another big aspect of the asymmetry in the game. As you can see, the cube economy is a bit specific in this game. On one hand, you've got the Commune player that has access to a lot of cubes, and on the other, you see that the Versailles player has access to significantly less cubes than the Commune player. And you can see this track here and a cube pool here. So the idea of a cube pool in Fort Sumter is that when cubes are removed from the board, they are getting stored in a cube pool. The concept is the same here. There is only one slight difference, is that Versailles' cube pool is unlimited. Whereas on the other hand, the cube pool of the Commune player doesn't exist at the beginning of the game. He needs to increase his revolutionary momentum to increase his operational capability of storing cubes when they are removed from the game. And the cube economy being a bit tight, having your cubes be removed from the game has a major impact on how much flexibility you have to take control over spaces, especially on Final Crisis. If the Commune player discards card to increase his momentum, he will have access to more and more spaces to store cubes and have more flexibility in his influence cube placement during the game. On the other hand, for the Versailles player, the thing is, he's not making sure that he has more operational capability, but he's making sure that he has access to more influence in the form of cubes that are becoming available to him. This simulates the fact that after the Franco-Prussian War, the Versailles government was quite weak, even though we had a lot of political control of the institutions and of the French country. It had a very weak army coming out of the war. And what this simulates is the collaboration that this government had with the Prussian invader that was also worried about the Paris insurrection, and that gave access to the newly formed government to prisoners of war that were captured a year before. Going back to our example, a player gets 4 cards, plays 3 of them, keeps 1 for Final Crisis. And this is really important. During each turn that you're playing, you're going to play 3 cards and keep 1 for Final Crisis face down. And when this is done, you actually score the dimensions. So if a player controls a dimension in a political category, he will win a political victory point. If a player controls a whole military dimension, he will score a military victory point. Then we reveal the objectives, and if an objective is control and is a political objective, you will win a political victory point, and if it is a military objective, you will win a military victory point. So that's basically the idea. Now let's talk a bit more about the differences between political and military spaces. So on top of giving you different kind of victory points, they also work in different ways when it comes to cube placement. And the idea is to move away a bit from the full abstraction that you could see in games like 13 Days or Fort Sumter, and give a bit more historical insights to the player, especially when it comes to military spaces. The advance of the Versailles troops toward Paris were very specific to that event. At that time, Paris was surrounded by forts that protected the city and came out actually of a siege of a few months by the Prussian army. And actually most of the east side of Paris was still controlled by the Prussian army. And one of the things that Versailles had to do was taking control of as much forts around Paris before they could actually prepare for a final attack within Paris. So on one hand, you've got the Commune player that is trying to keep control of Paris space and prevent as much the Versailles advance toward Paris. And on the other hand, you've got the Versailles player who's taking position and trying to take control surrounding the city. So I wanted to represent that tactical dimension of the event in its geographical representation. So the idea is that for you to be able to place cubes in military spaces, you must already control a space that is adjacent to a space that you're targeting. So at the beginning of the game, you have this locked geographical space that is Versailles, that is always controlled by the Versailles player, which means that at the beginning of the game, the Versailles player has access to Mont Valérien and Fort d'Issy. On the other hand, the Commune player starts with an influence cube in Père Lachaise, so it means that he already controls that space. Give him access to Butte Montmartre, Butte aux Cailles, and the Château de Vincennes. And the idea is that you're going to spread gradually in those spaces and try to prevent your opponent to grow. So you have different ways to do this. You do cube placement, cube removal, but you also have a specific mechanic that has been introduced in that game, and those are barricades and fortifications. The Versailles player has 2 tokens, so it's a specific kind of influence tokens that gives a defensive value to a space. If a space has a fortification or if a space has a barricade, it becomes more difficult for the opponent to get into it. You get barricade and fortification through events, whether objective events or strategic events, and it gives you an edge when it comes to defending a space. Once you've played your 3 regular turns, or once one player breaches final crisis before turn 3, you go to the final crisis. And that's also one of the major differences that you have with Fort Sumter or even 13 days. So as I said before, during your 3 regular turns, during each of those turns, you actually store cards for the final crisis. And here what happens is, at the end of the game, those cards that you left aside becomes your final hand for the final crisis. So you reveal those cards, and what happens is that, as for regular turns, you will have to play 3 cards, but you will only play them for their events. So when playing a card in Final Crisis, you don't have this choice anymore about buying an event, playing for operations, or increasing your player momentum. The only thing that matters in Final Crisis is the event itself. And the twist here is, let's say I'm the Versailles player and those are the cards that I have access to in my hand, is I have 2 cards of my own faction. When I will play them, I will decide whether and how those events are resolved. But if I play an event from my opponent, whether it's me or not playing, it doesn't matter. As soon as the event of a faction's player is being played, it's the faction player that decides how the event is going to be resolved. So there is a huge risk in putting aside your player's event in previous turn if you are filling your hand for Final Crisis with your opponent's events, because he will then have more opportunities to take actions during the Final Crisis. So that's the decision making that you have to make through the whole process of the 3 regular turns. And the whole idea is, it's not only about making sure that you're not keeping your opponent's event, but it's also thinking about what do you want to achieve during Final Crisis. So when you have a hand of card, what you're going to think about is, this is events that I need to use now to fulfill my specific objectives or my short-term strategy, but each time you play and decide to keep something for the end of the game, it's actually part of a long-term strategy that you've been thinking about for a while. So that's you have those 2 layers of decision making: short-term while during the turn, and long-term because you're preparing your Final Crisis. And then you have Final Crisis scoring, and this is where you actually decide which player is the winner. So as I said, the first way to win is to have more victory points than your opponent, and making sure that your opponent doesn't have advantage on your victory condition. So if you're Versailles, you need to make sure that the military VP is here or on your side, and if you're the Commune, making sure that the political VP marker is on the 0 space or on your side, to make sure that you have your victory conditions fulfilled. If it's not the case though, the first tiebreaker is the number of objectives that each player will have resolved during previous turns. So you've got up to 3 attempts at taking control of an objective, and if one player has fulfilled 3 objectives and another had fulfilled only 2, and we are at a tie in victory points, the player that has fulfilled the most objective wins. And finally, if it is still a tie, the final tiebreaker during final crisis is the initiative card. And that's the last thing that I'm going to talk about. There are other aspects of the game that you will discover when it will be released or maybe in an upcoming video. But I think that the initiative card is an interesting bit because it wasn't in previous games of the game system. The initiative card is a card that indicates which player controls the player turn order. So at the beginning of a turn, what we do is we calculate the initiative of each player. And the initiative is basically the number of political points that a player has subtracted to his momentum. So let's say we're starting turn 2, and we have the Commune player who has 3 victory points, political victory points, and has a revolutionary momentum of 1. And we have the Versailles player that has a Prussian collaboration momentum of 1. In this case, when we calculate initiative, we have for the Versailles player, he's at -3, -1, so he's at -4. And on the other side, you have the Commune player, he's at +3, -1, so he's at 2. So he is ahead, which means that the Commune player has the initiative. What this means is that the Commune player will decide if he wants to play the card first, and if he does, he will decide to keep the initiative and play a strategy card first during that turn. But if he does, it gives him a bit of a tactical disadvantage. The game is really tight, and usually being able to be the last one to play a card during a turn is basically having an edge. So he can take the decision of leaving the initiative to the Versailles player and flipping the card. And if he does that, it means that he will be the last player to play a card during the turn. But on the other hand, it means that the initiative flips, and that at the end of the turn, it is the initiative player that will decide in which order dimensions are resolved and in which order objective events are going to be resolved, which can have a major impact, especially when you have to manage a very tight cube economy and you have limited spaces to store cubes. So that's the initiative bit. And of course, it's the final tiebreaker, so it might have a very important implication at the end of the game. If you see that the game is going to be a tie, to be in a position when you can decide who is the initiative player at the end of the game is probably the best way to win. So that's it. That's a brief and general overview of the game through the turn sequence. Of course, I didn't explain every aspect of the game. As you can see, it's a gateway wargame CDG. The game plays in around, I would say, half an hour, not more than this. It's pretty compact, pretty tight, and it's actually quite achievable to do 2 games in a row in less than an hour. But it does introduce some mechanics, some new mechanics, and a level of asymmetry that you don't necessarily see in other games of the same range. I hope that this presentation got you interested in the game. If you are, I put a link in the description to the GMT P500 page so you can learn more about the game mechanics. And I will also add in the description the 2 historical articles that I published in Inside GMT around the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune. Thank you for watching. Feel free to add some question in the comment section, and I will also add a link to the BGG thread about the game and the Consim thread about the game, so if you want to follow up on those platforms, because that's a platform that you're active on, you will also have the links over there. So thank you for watching. I hope that this excites you as much as I'm excited about it, and see you soon.